Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Okay, good evening, everybody. It is time for the next couple of from the 48 liberal lies about American history that you probably learned in school. Quite the title, huh? Okay, we're on lie number 5. I have to get out the cheaters here. I think these were fairly short, so I'll probably do 2 or 3 tonight. All right, lie number 5. John F. Kennedy was killed by LBJ and a secret team to keep him from getting us out of Vietnam. Apparently that's the lie. All right, so starting off with a quote, again, like usual. Short one. There was a secret election in 1963. That's it. David Lifton, Best Evidence, the video. Book title, Blood, Money, and Power, How LBJ Killed JFK by Barr McClellan, but there's no quote from that one. I don't know why. Anyway, here we go. Compared to some of the other humdingers featured in this book, this particular lie probably doesn't have much currency with too many Americans, but because it has been immortalized in the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, it requires addressing. Needless to say, Stone didn't come up with this idea on his own, but relied instead on a slew of conspiracy books about the Kennedy assassination. The most prominent of these is L. Fletcher Prudy's Secret Team, 1973. Prudy, X, played by Donald Sutherland in JFK, claimed that, quote-unquote big business, the military, and the CIA, with Lyndon Johnson's blessings, whacked the President of the United States on November 22nd, 1963, because Kennedy planned to, quote-unquote, get us out of Vietnam as soon as the election was over. The Jacobite mythology, as some Kennedy scribes have called the legend, evolved as a form of Camelot spin control the instant the president died. Writer William Manchester was given full access to develop his Death of a President, while historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. turned out an ode to JFK's administration, 1,000 Days, where Kennedy was portrayed as a tough anti-communist. However, by the late 60s, the mood of the liberal parts of the United States had shifted strongly against the Vietnam War, requiring revisions of the Kennedy mythology. Specifically, Kennedy had to be turned from a hawk into a dove to maintain continuity with his, by then, left-leaning brother Bobby. Moreover, there was no passion play if virtually no policy differences. There was no passion play if virtually no policy differences existed between JFK, Lyndon Johnson, and Republican Richard Nixon. A frontal assault on Johnson and Nixon coincided with a radical makeover of the Kennedy hawk image, which in turn meant coming up with some plausible story that Kennedy planned to withdraw all U.S. troops from Vietnam right after the election. A few basic facts are in order when it comes to the Prudy Stone fantasy. First, the notion that the military-industrial complex wanted into Vietnam because Bell Helicopter, based in Texas, would get work is nearly beyond comment. Despite the perennial fear of the military-industrial complex that the left lives under, all the top military contractors put together couldn't equal the revenues of a major car company or McDonald's. That's a bunch of bullshit. I don't agree with him on that at all. A single one, even in Texas, was almost irrelevant. In terms of both votes and political clout, and a single division of a single company is barely worth making a campaign stop for, let alone expanding a war over. More to the point, what Stone and other conspiracy nuts completely miss is that helicopters were not used in the context of troop delivery systems for offensive military actions until late 1965. This was 2 years after Kennedy's assassination. No one had even conceived of choppers as the new cavalry until Colonel Hal Moore's 7th Cavalry experimented with them at the Battle of the Ladrang Valley, which is We Were Soldiers, the movie, is all about that. As to the Kennedy assassination itself, the problem is that the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald is both too good and yet not good enough. Had he lived, Oswald certainly would have been convicted on the available evidence and procedures of the day, which of course would not be applicable in 2008. Although a 1992 American Bar Association mock trial of Oswald resulted in a hung jury, a 1986 mock trial with famous attorneys Vincent Bugliosi for the prosecution and Gary Spence for Oswald resulted in a guilty verdict for Oswald and a majority no on the question of a conspiracy. Regardless, modern jurors cannot escape the 30 years of questions raised by the conspiracy camp and certainly have been tainted. No one knows if the palm print on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, Oswald's print, plus his order form for the gun, the ballistics linking the bullets to the gun, and the photo of him with the gun would have provided proof beyond a reasonable doubt to convict Oswald in any modern court. In 1964 or 1965, the outcome would have been virtually certain, but Jack Ruby, thinking he was doing the nation a favor by exacting vigilante justice on JFK's killer, in fact condemned the United States to at least another 50 years of debate over what various people said, saw, or did on November 22, 1963. In addition to the LBJ did it school, there are other conspiracy interpretations, the most prominent of which are, there's several of them. They're all numbered here. 1. The Mafia did it. This theory maintains that in retribution for JFK's failure to get Bobby off their back, the Mafia dons had the president assassinated. Most of the mob theories originate from Kennedy's love-hate relationship with organized crime, using Mafia hitmen via the CIA to try to eliminate Castro. These efforts were unsuccessful, but the mob expected payment anyway, and its terms, supposedly discussed at the outset, involved having Attorney General Robert Kennedy stop his effective campaign against organized crime bosses. When he did not, the mob retaliated. Oswald, in their views, is either a willing or unsuspecting accomplice who is indeed the patsy for the syndicate. Evidence supporting these views comes from comments made by Sam Giancana, head of the Chicago mob. Wiretap comments of New Orleans mobster Carlos Marcello, and the well-known deal struck by the Kennedys and the Mafia that was directed through mail folder drop-offs when Judy Exner would sexually service the president at regular meetings with him. Further variations on this theme involved the television revelations that a squad of Corsican hitmen performed the deed, or that a Texan named Ricky White was the real shooter. Number 2. The Cubans, either pro or anti-Castro, did it. In this view, members of the Cuban exile community, angry over the Bay of Pigs, or Cuban secret police, angry over the Bay of Pigs, assassinated Kennedy and set up Oswald. There is less evidence for this view, although the motive was probably more credible than that of the mob theory. The Secret Service had already investigated a reliable report of an assassination threat coming from Miami in the days prior to Dallas. And I think we're about to hit an ad, it says. So, I will pause. Give it like 30 seconds here. I think that's what my ads are set to. I don't know how long. It should be 30 seconds for the ad. Okay, that's probably long enough. All right. Number 3, the government did it, part 2. A second government tack is more credible than the LBJ did it argument. This view holds that Johnson had nothing to do with the assassination, but that a rogue team of disaffected CIA agents, military malcontents, and other administration loose cannons pulled off a silent coup from within. Again, aside from the substantial problem of lack of evidence, which are vastly greater for advocates of either variant of the government did it positions, the obvious question is, what was to be gained from substituting Johnson for Kennedy? It was JFK who ordered the invasion of Cuba, who nearly went to war over the Soviet missiles, and who had increased American troop strength in Vietnam from 600 to 16,000 in a 3-year period. And number 4, the body was altered. A sub-theme of the last explanation comes from David Lifton's book, Best Evidence. He subscribed to the LBJ did it view, but his book is important because he actually uncovered evidence, or more accurately, he brought to the public's attention material already in evidence, that Kennedy's body might have been altered between the procedures at Dallas and the autopsy at Bethesda, Maryland. Lifton provided impressive interviews with the personnel who put Kennedy into a fancy bronze ceremonial coffin at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, contrasted with interviews of U.S. Navy personnel who took the body out of a gray shipping casket. The dressing of the body, the condition of the head wound, and many other characteristics of the body were dramatically different in the two sets of eyewitness accounts. This led Lifton to the conclusion that the body had been altered after the assassination to cover up the crime. Whether anyone could have gained access to the body or not is the issue. David Rohn has produced an excellent website with each argument, including the body alteration argument dissected. In the case of Lifton's thesis, Rohn deals effectively with virtually all of the evidence except the eyewitness statements Lifton has caught on the video version of his book. Okay, that's the 4 theories, supposedly. But even if it is somehow true that the body underwent a pre-autopsy at Walter Reed Army Hospital prior to its rather late arrival at Bethesda, it might be due to a genuine concern that the government was determining whether there were multiple shooters, especially Soviet assassins, so as to prepare a responsible policy response to the likelihood that foreign nationals besides Oswald had been involved. In other words, one might accept some of Lifton's evidence without reaching the same conclusions as he did about its meaning. Needless to say, whatever theory one subscribes to, the proponents of one or all 4 of the other interpretations will come after you hammer and tong. Although they will all benefit from each other's work, the researchers are a competitive and ideologically diverse group, each of whom is convinced of the rightness of his or her own view. Although Michael Kurtz, a professional historian, has argued a case for conspiracy, the large majority of historians have agreed with the government's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Of course it's the government's conclusion. But other victims of the Kennedy-Oswald shootings were journalism and the media. Virtually all of the majors got the coverage secondhand, and none had any role in uncovering any of the evidence on Oswald or anyone else. After the Warren Commission, the mainstream media accepted the lone gunman story whole hog, leaving non-professionals to uncover all the rather shocking and perhaps important details that surfaced later. The media blew it badly with the JFK assassination and spent the next decade attempting to reestablish its credibility. No, they didn't. They spent the decade, well, maybe right afterwards, but they spent this past decade destroying their credibility again. Spent the next decade attempting to reestablish its credibility, even if it meant swinging in the other direction with full-scale assaults on Johnson, Richard Nixon, and the military during Vietnam. As to Oswald's guilt, while the 1993 bestseller Case Closed by attorney Gerald Posner has some flaws, his convincing evidence concerning the so-called magic bullet, which turns out to be not so magic at all when the seats in the presidential limousine were aligned as they were in 1963, indeed closes the case. While a number of strange loose ends remain, the absence of any other gunshot sounds at the scene in 1963, the event was caught on tape, the inability of a single conspiracy theorist to produce one bullet tied to the crime other than Oswald's, or indeed any forensic evidence at all, and the fact that the only actual fraud exposed over the years has been on the part of the conspiracy camp, leaves us with the verdict of guilty for Lee Harvey Oswald, not Lyndon Baines Johnson. If he was writing this nowadays, I don't think he would have that same attitude about that. He was writing this, 15 years ago. Anyway. So, man. Oh, this next one's really short. 3.5 pages. And then 4 pages for the next one. So maybe I'll get through 3 tonight. All right, so lie number 6. Richard Nixon expanded the Vietnam War. In April we're starting with 2 quotes again. In April 1970, Nixon sent American forces on a sweep through Cambodia, a seeming escalation of fighting. This move electrified the anti-war movement. That's by Erwin Unger, These United States. And then the second quote is, "You've got to electrify the people," Nixon told the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Let's go blow the hell out of the Viet Cong North Vietnamese." And that one is from Mark C. Carnes and John A. Garrity, American Destiny. Okay. No matter how patently absurd something is, if you repeat it often enough, many people will eventually believe it. Yeah. Researchers have in fact discovered that in a given population, up to 1/3 of a subject group's opinions can be made to change if other members of the group, who are in fact plants, change their opinion. Given the malleability, no wonder so many Americans believe that Richard Nixon somehow was increasing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, when it is abundantly obvious he ended the American presence in Vietnam. Cross-reference this with lie number 5, whereby the conspiracy theorists had John Kennedy getting whacked by the dark forces that may have included Lyndon Johnson in order to keep him from pulling us out of Vietnam. This was the underpinning of David Lifton's bestseller, Best Evidence, 1980, which subtly argued that Lyndon Johnson had ordered a hit on Kennedy because the president was about to pull out of Vietnam after the election. Lifton, of course, was not alone in this theory, made famous in the Oliver Stone movie JFK, which was based on Jim Garrison's 1988 book On the Trail of the Assassins. John Newman, JFK in Vietnam, 1992, and David Kaiser, American Tragedy, 2000. Likewise perpetuated the JFK would have gotten us out mythology developed by the Jacobites, as JFK official John Roche called them. Roche recalled odd stories that let me start that sentence over. Roche recalled odd stories that surfaced whereby Kennedy told speechwriter and friend Kenny O'Donnell that once he was reelected, he'd get out of Vietnam, and that Johnson had somehow betrayed the Kennedy trust by plunging the United States into a war JFK would have disapproved of. Then there are the facts. When John Kennedy promised to pay any price and bear any burden, there were far fewer than 1,000 U.S. advisors in all of Southeast Asia. Many put the number at around 600. The new president had already received a briefing from Dwight Eisenhower's Joint Chiefs of Staff that told him 40,000 American soldiers would be needed to combat about 17,000 Viet Cong guerrillas and more than 120,000 if the North Vietnamese got involved. Kennedy developed the famed Green Berets especially for Vietnam and shipped off the first 500 graduates. Okay. They were only the tip of the iceberg. Under JFK, some 17,000 troops arrived in South Vietnam. In one unguarded moment, Kennedy actually referred to the 25,000 American troops in Southeast Asia, although it's not clear if he included Thailand and other areas near Vietnam. The 25,000 figure was ironically used to further the Jacobite myth by John McCone, former director of the CIA. The U.S. Army's own history of Vietnam notes that there were, quote, almost 24,000 by the end of 1964. Of these, 15,000 were Army, end quote. Kennedy himself said at Billings, Montana, in September 1963, that in Vietnam, quote, over 25,000 of your sons and daughters are bearing arms, end quote. When Kennedy did remove 1,000 troops in 1963, the National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, issued a memo that ordered, quote, No formal announcement be made of the implementation of plans to withdraw 1,000 military personnel, end quote. Indeed, the 1,000 troops consisted mostly of an engineering battalion whose work was completed. Without question, Kennedy inserted the United States into Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson expanded the number of troops to 553,000 by 1969. When Richard Nixon became president, Nixon promised peace with honor, or, in other words, withdrawal from making sure South Vietnam was secure, while remaining vague during the campaign of 1968. Nixon privately intended to Vietnamize the war through increased training of Vietnamese troops and heavy bombing of the North, while secretly he also planned to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. By 1971, he had reduced the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam to under 200,000, and by February 1972, the number fell by another 45,000. Ironically, Nixon's troop reductions benefited from Johnson's greatest public relations disaster, the Tet Offensive, which utterly annihilated the Viet Cong as a fighting force. General Tran Van Tra, a top communist official, said of Tet, quote, "We suffered large sacrifices and losses with regard to manpower and material," end quote. American military historian Robert Leckie called Tet, quote, "the most appalling defeat in the history of the war and an unmitigated disaster," end quote, for Hanoi. American forces killed so many communists that North Vietnamese leaders quipped they could only stand a few more such victories. Thus, by the time Nixon entered the White House, he was dealing with victories. Thus, by the time Nixon entered the White House, he was dealing with a war that was very nearly won on the battlefield, if lost in newsrooms and homes. Nixon's carrot and stick approach included the first ever efforts to pursue North Vietnamese soldiers across the Cambodian border and to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The United States also increased bombing of North Vietnam under Operation Linebacker II, December 1972, which, according to witnesses inside Hanoi, including some U.S. prisoners of war, badly staggered the North Vietnamese government. Although early in Linebacker the Air Force took severe losses, the Americans adapted to enemy tactics and soon had extremely light losses while wreaking havoc with the communists. Polls showed Nixon had a 65% approval rating in 1972 for his handling of the war. Nixon had been successful in the short term in going over the heads of the media straight to the American public. Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to Paris to meet with Le Duc Tho, and they hammered out an agreement in January 1973. Before he resigned over Watergate, Nixon had withdrawn all but 50,000 American troops, and South Vietnam temporarily remained free. Nixon's stick, American air power, nevertheless remained a powerful incentive for the communists to behave. All of that depended on South Vietnam having an ally in the Oval Office, namely Nixon, and when Watergate spiraled into a near impeachment, South Vietnam's best friend resigned. Almost immediately, Congress pulled the plug on further U.S. aid to South Vietnam, and in January 1975 it was overrun. The Democrat-controlled Congress ignored President Gerald Ford's appeals to help the Vietnamese, leading not only to the tragedy of up to 1 million deaths in Vietnam and countless boat people who fled, but also to the 1 million deaths in nearby Cambodia, which fell exactly as predicted by the domino theory so derided by liberals. Nixon's resignation, accompanied by the rise of a predominantly liberal media and abetted by entrenched liberal academics, ensured that only Nixon's role in Watergate would define his presidency, not his successful conclusion of the war. It remains one of the most one of the great ironies of American history that the man who got us into the war, Kennedy, receives almost no blame or criticism for his actions, while the man who extracted us, in line with supposedly the wishes of liberals, is routinely portrayed as though he had started rather than ended the conflict. And that's the end of that one. Interesting. There's some stuff I had never heard there. Um, Still, I don't agree with him completely on everything in here, but it's still an interesting read. All right, so one more tonight. This one's 4 pages, so it shouldn't be too bad. This is lie number 7. The peace movement, quote unquote, activists were not dupes of the KGB. All right, we have 3 quotes to start this one off. Reagan's tough talk, coupled with the military buildup and the faltering of arms control, sparked a grassroots reaction as millions of Americans felt a growing threat of nuclear war. Concerned citizens campaigned for a freeze on the manufacture and development of nuclear weapons. In June 1982, 800,000 anti-nuclear protesters rallied in New York's Central Park. That one is from Paul S. Boyer et al. From The Enduring Vision. Second quote, caption to a photo. A nuclear freeze rally in New York City in 1982. For a time, the movement to halt the introduction of new nuclear weapons challenged President Reagan's plans for an arms buildup. That one is by John Boydston et al. From Making a Nation. And then the third quote, during 1983, the anti-war and nuclear disarmament movements, in eclipse since the end of the Vietnam War, revived explosively. There were demonstrations in major cities to protest the arms race and demand a nuclear freeze. And that one is from Erwin Unger from These United States. All right. Viewing such comments, certainly one must conclude these anti-nuke protesters were merely concerned people, average Americans who, quote-unquote, felt a growing fear, as Boyer's Enduring Vision claims, or perhaps as Unger's These United States suggests, quote, public jitters were amplified by Jonathan Schell's best-selling book, The Fate of the Earth, end quote. Of course, it should be kept in mind that public jitters were also amplified by Orson Welles's 1938 radio broadcast, The War of the Worlds. It doesn't necessarily mean the jitters had any grounds for their amplification. When it comes to admitting that anti-war activists were in fact useful idiots of the communists for almost 40 years, the sound of mea culpas from the leaders of the American left is deafening. Deafeningly silent, that is. Now, with access to the former Soviet Union's archives, the influence of the Soviet KGB East German agents in the European and American anti-war, anti-nuclear, and nuclear freeze movement is provable. The KGB ramped up its activities as never before against the man it considered to be far more anti-Soviet than any recent president, Ronald Reagan. Agents floated stories in foreign presses that Reagan's health had been affected by his father's alcoholism, and Yuri Andropov, chairman of the KGB, ordered all his agents to make their first priority the defeat of Reagan in the 1984 election. They failed. They infiltrated the European and American freeze movements to stop deployment of the, quote, the Euro missiles and the Strategic Defense Initiative. They failed there too. Long before the KGB infiltrated the peace movement, however, the Soviets had engaged in remarkable, occasionally loony antics that mirrored the CIA's attempts to get Fidel Castro's cigars to explode. Vasily Mitrokhin, an archivist for the KGB who smuggled out enormous numbers of files, documented a front publisher who originated the Oliver Stone-themed notion that Lee Harvey Oswald was the FBI CIA agent who worked for the military-industrial complex. The KGB also conceived the notion that the AIDS virus had been made by U.S. biological experts at Fort Detrick, Maryland, and spread into the Third World. I wouldn't be surprised if that was true, honestly. Even the communists themselves were shocked at how easily some of their lies spread, and were equally perturbed that others had no effect. For example, their attempts to make a dent in Reagan's re-election effort. What is obvious from Mitrokhin's data and other materials now available to Western researchers is that the KGB desperately attempted to shape American domestic politics. Soviet subsidies to the Communist Party USA reached $2 million a year in the 1970s. Every embassy and consulate was an active outpost of KGB activity. Often for their own survival within the Soviet system, KGB officers overstated their effectiveness, but frequently the reason they were not more successful, as the agents noted, was precisely because sometimes the Western peace movements did their bidding without being told. For example, the Politburo in 1976, quote, extolled the value of encouraging the peace movement as a means to weaken Western resolve, end quote, and Moscow funded protest groups that opposed the neutron bomb in 1977. When Germans Petra Kelly and her boyfriend, former General Gert Bastian, came to the United States in 1981 to oppose Reagan's policies, the media tour was arranged by the American anti-military activist group SANE, S-A-N-E. Whether SANE leadership knew or cared that Bastian was on the payroll of the East German Stasi, secret police, is not known, but perhaps not surprisingly, Bastian's group organized mass protests against both Secretary of State Alexander Haig and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. When they visited Germany, but were noticeably absent from Leonid Brezhnev, when Leonid Brezhnev came to Bonn in November 1981. The German Peace Union received 5 million Deutschmarks annually from the Stasi, while Sergei Grigoriev, a top official in the USSR's International Department, funded peace groups through public organizations. This is a quote. Quote, public organizations and a number of communist parties. Millions of dollars were injected into the creation of all sorts of ad hoc groups and coalitions, end quote. Needless to say, not a single one of these peace groups ever had the slightest problem with any Soviet policy anywhere. In 1976, Yuri Andropov told the Politburo of the value of the Western peace movement. Quote, we have to open up a wider network to win public opinion, to mobilize public opinion of the Western countries of Europe and America against the location of the nuclear weapons in Europe, end quote. One peace commission, started by former Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, named as the Soviet representative Georgy Arbatov, a secret agent for the KGB. Ted Turner, founder of CNN, asked Arbatov to join the board of directors of his Better World Society, presumably under the assumption that having the KGB represented made it a better world. Then there was the World Peace Council, supposedly committed to global disarmament, which of course never meant Soviet disarmament. The Politburo funded the World Peace Council to the tune of $50 million a year under the strict control of the Central Committee of the USSR. Certainly the KGB took credit for, quote, stirring up the anti-military movement in countries of the West, end quote. 25 members of the Bundestag who opposed the installation of the Euro missiles were outed in the 1990s as paid agents of the German Democratic Republic. It wasn't just the infiltration of peace organizations in the West. The Soviets had so completely buffaloed American liberal politicians that they might as well have been on the payroll of the Central Committee. Senator George McGovern called Yuri Andropov a, quote, reasonable guy and somewhat restrained, end quote. He was thankful that Andropov ran the Kremlin because he could save the world from the war that McGovern was sure Reagan wanted. McGovern was typical of well-meaning Soviet dupes. Ronald Reagan once met Dr. Helen Caldecott, one of the leaders of the Freeze movement, in the Oval Office and wrote, quote, she seems like a nice, caring person, but knows an awful lot of things that aren't true, end quote. Similarly, he wrote in 1981, quote, sometimes I think, forgive me, the National Council of Churches believes God can be reached through Moscow, end quote. Without question, however, excuse me. Without question, however, the confluence of Soviet KGB activities in the peace movement reached its apex in the 1982 to 1984 battles over deployment of the Pershing and cruise missiles in Western Europe to counter the SS-20s the Soviets had already put in place west of the Urals. One KGB agent bragged to his embassy counselor to London in July 1982 that, quote, it was us, the KGB residency, who brought 250,000 people out onto the streets, end quote. Evidence shows, however, that the KGB participated in the London demonstration but did not organize it. Indeed, one center created by the KGB in London to direct such operations found that they did not need to. The Western peace movements were their dupes, and enthusiastically and reliably mounting anti-U.S. campaigns at the drop of a hat. After it failed to prevent the deployment of the Western Euro missiles, the KGB Countermeasures Directorate actively sought the defeat of Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election. Agents were immediately sent off to dig up dirt on Reagan and were instructed to popularize the slogan among the peace crowd, Reagan eto wojna. Reagan means war. Reagan's Star Wars, see lie number 8, which is the next one. Yeah. Defense shield buried the freeze movement once and for all, as the Soviets made abundantly clear they knew the system would work. Far from being as historians claimed, quote, unsettling, not possibly technically, end quote, it not only was proven possible, but is now, possible technically, proven possible, but is now deployed. Historians who brushed off Soviet involvement in peace efforts, to quote Ricky Ricardo, have some splaining to do, quote unquote. And that is the end of lie 7. Lie 8. Jesus, I take those off and all of a sudden I can't see anything. I think they're the wrong power. Lie number 8 has a typo in it. But Ronald Reagan knew Star Wars wouldn't work, but wanted to provoke a war with the USSR. That'll be the next one for next time. So those all three were interesting. I don't totally agree with him based on things we've heard in the last 15 years that he didn't know about when he wrote this. But yeah, I'm enjoying it so far. Long way to go, though. We're just getting up to 8. Barely a fifth of the way through the book. So, alrighty. And on that note, let's see who's around. Do we want to raid somebody? We've got some Grounded, some Rage 2. I haven't seen Rage 2. Let's go look at Rage 2. Bear with me a minute. We will head on over there.
My heart is beating. I know the reasons. Which one is broken and one is
Miss Blitzer.
because I have seen them all apart. I've known somebody I needed to have and be sad.